Physical space is a premium good. Before capitalism, owning a large amount of space was hard work. You needed to tend to the land and make good of it. You had to build wells to obtain its groundwater, flatten it for building homes and churches, or cultivate it to grow crops and livestock. You couldn't endlessly acquire land. A lot of it would go to waste, revert back to nature. You might as well have not even traded for it at that point. Let's fast forward through about 2,000 years of capitalism. There we are. The Victorian elite. They owned massive swaths of grass. They owned a ton of land, so much so that being able to grow useless, carefully maintained nothing was kind of a status symbol. The poor were cramped together and their limited space was justified in that they were so poor they wouldn't be able to fill that space. If they could, they should purchase more land, not material goods with that money. Even today, having a large amount of open space in your home, say about 2.5 meters on each end, is very hard to come by and can be a greatly limiting factor if your product requires it. Naturally, this is a video about VR. I just recently got a headset of my very own, and after fighting with setting it up for a few days thanks to the might and majesty of Windows Mixed Reality, I was able to enjoy VR mostly unimpeded, with plenty of cable room, but no other real space. This is the space I have accessible for VR at the current moment, and this camera makes it look so much bigger. This is the most spacious private location I have available in this house, and I can guarantee I am not an isolated case. With any other gaming hardware, the footprint is comparatively small and you can play your games in whatever seat you have available. There were exceptions prior to VR for sure. All I need to do is insinuate this guy going through a television screen to explain myself. But a large object-free space to not just swing your arms side to side but also take some steps, and that again was never really required before. Many people simply don't have that space, so they won't purchase VR. And that's valid. In fact, I'd argue that that's where VR will ultimately perish. At the current moment, 2% of all Steam users own a VR headset of some description, and the best-selling HMD, the PlayStation VR headset, has sold 5 million units versus the 100 million PlayStation 4s out there, putting us at about the same market penetration rate. One argument is that VR is still in its infancy, despite the fact that head-mounted display technology goes back 50 years to the work of Bob Sproul and Ivan Sutherland, and despite the fact that a chain of VR arcades existed in the late 90s run by the Walt Disney Corporation. Fellas, Disney Quest existed and it had motion-controlled controllers you swung around in each hand. This tech is old. While it is true that consumer-grade personal VR equipment is an invention only about 10 years old and commercial headsets only started arriving in people's hands in the last 5 or so years, this can hardly be cited as the reason VR hasn't taken off. Otherwise, sales numbers for higher-end consumer hardware like the PlayStation 4 Pro would be just as low. Speaking of, other arguments mention the high price points, but that isn't as much of a concern in 2020 as it was in 2016. The HTC Vive launched in April 2016 at a price of $800, with a resolution per eye of 1080 by 1200 pixels. Nowadays, the Oculus Rift S, Facebook's newest headset, runs at half that price with a higher resolution, effectively just the cost of a new game console. Actually, as an aside, there is a standalone Rift S, the Oculus Quest. It's also sold at that same price, and it effectively is just a game console at that point. All of the processor hardware is stored inside the headset. It might be more comparable to put the HTC Vive and the Valve Index side by side, as both use base stations to track a player in room-sized space, whereas the Rift didn't come with enough bases out of the box to run room scale. But the newest Rift iteration is able to build a room-scale tracking space through the use of infrared cameras built into the headset, so we can't really downplay innovation when discussing development in this space. Another argument is that VR requires a substantial computer to run, that most consumers have to completely upgrade their kit to run VR, and that's the actual entry cost. But according to the Steam hardware survey, RAM between 8 and 16 gigabytes is the most common. Most VR headsets ask for 8 minimum. Most users have the CPU speed for VR, and of all 21 video cards used by over 1% of all Steam users, 15 of them, including the GTX 1060, the most common GPU, are all VR compatible, with new cards coming out of Nvidia and AMD being built for VR from the ground up, even at their lower end cards. Most people with a dedicated gaming computer or even just a high-end retail machine have the means to play VR titles if it's from the past couple years. The last real common argument is that there's just not enough games. And sure, I understand this one. Consumer VR has been a gamble for many companies, and the only real AAAs to make profit from VR titles are companies who have just been able to stick a VR player controller into their game and throw it loose to the world. Valve likely spent the same amount of money on Half-Life Alyx that other developers would spend on AAA titles, which would put us in the ballpark of about $100 million. If each copy of Half-Life Alyx was $100, Valve still wouldn't have made a profit at this point. But that's not the point. Valve earns roughly $10 million from game and microtransaction sales on Steam every day, which means a month of business as usual will supplant the cost of Half-Life Alyx's development. They are really the only company who can make AAA VR development work at this point. As for everybody else, it's a small ecosystem with slow growth. Dumping dozens of millions of dollars into developing a game and losing most of it just is not good business. Most devs made a VR port of a game of theirs back in 2017 or 2018, it flopped, and they moved on as this isn't where the money is. So because you can't get big name titles in beloved franchises like Halo, Grand Theft Auto, or Titanfall in VR, and because all the AAA titles you can get are last generation sloppy seconds that are simply not as stable as the non-VR releases, few buy into the ecosystem. It's not the fault of gamers or developers alone, it's a symbiotic relationship between the two. That really leaves us with two major issues left, and they're two I don't hear being talked about nearly as much as GPU costs or the lack of software. Accessibility and space. The two are ever so slightly related, but when I mention accessibility in VR, I am specifically referring to one's physical condition. Traditional video gaming requires precision in one's fine motor skills, and this has been a common complaint with gaming over the past several decades. People with disabilities or amputees are just not able to enjoy video games as much as able-bodied people. Devices like the Microsoft Adaptive Controller, which can accept inputs from a large number of sources to allow people to use external buttons and joysticks, those exist to help players enjoy games even in these situations, but making a similar device for VR would be next to impossible. In VR, your controllers are motion sensitive. The headset updates the in-game camera seamlessly through monitoring not just X, Y, and Z position in physical space, but also its roll, its pitch, its yaw. And many games and experiences utilize additional sensors one might strap to their legs or something to provide a greater degree of accuracy in character movement. You can't make all of this disability friendly, sad to say. You can make seated experiences that don't use the controllers or are compatible with a traditional gamepad and thus compatible with the adaptive controller. But that puts us back in 2015 for VR, when the Oculus Rift dev kit came with an Xbox controller and back when Dumpy the Elephant was a VR indie highlight. It's worth it to mention that most modern VR experiences assume the player has two motion controllers, and are otherwise nearly impossible to play correctly, which means that even a one-handed player is unable to properly enjoy Half-Life Alyx or other similar titles. But also, the other side of accessibility isn't just the player's physical ability as a person, but how accessible VR is within their space. And that's the point. Space is a premium good. VR specifically requires a curated, roughly rectangular space to play properly, and while many titles are compatible with standing or seated experiences, many more are not, and those are seen as inferior ways to play those games. Just check the comments of any video filmed in seated VR and you'll find people telling the player to stand up. You're not playing it right. The most popular original VR title is Beat Saber, which requires a player to shift left and right, duck, and more vitally, flail directly in front of themselves to hit targets. Even in more subdued titles like VR Gun Range Simulator, Hot Dogs, Horseshoes, and Hand Grenades, players have to have the space in front of them to wield the game's 300 plus weapons. With pistols and revolvers, this is definitely doable for most able-bodied users, but as the player acquires larger weapons, they must hold the foregrip in order to maintain accuracy and stability, and on some larger weapons like the light machine guns or sniper rifles, this can become a problem in a user's space. Additionally, you need a lot of space outside of the play space as well. With traditional consumer VR equipment, at least 2 base stations must be placed on the outer edge of the space, pointed so they can blast infrared light into the entirety of that space and track the player. They have to have ample cable management to run the wires to their PC without becoming intrusive. For many people, this means sticking hooks or pulleys into the ceiling, which not everyone can do. You could use adhesive hooks and such in a space with an overzealous landlord, but that's some loose paper towels on a bullet wound, honestly. All of this in mind, the success of VR inherently relies on how available a large swatch of space in a player's home becomes, which means that VR will simply not be able to grow beyond being a luxury niche. The same way that in-home arcade cabinets or proper physical full-sized billiards or ping pong tables have always been. We can make more seated experiences, more gamepad-centric experiences, but at what point would we have just made a game that doesn't need a $400 headset to experience? Why couldn't what we have developed just be a $60 title that runs on any old display? Does stereoscopic 3D and head tracking grant any additional benefits? Simply put, is VR really the future of games? A lot of signs point to no, and it's got too many downsides and too much prep work to really become a viable alternative to the keyboard and mouse or the gamepad, which limits the number of players, which limits the amount of software, which limits the number of players again. It's one big, long chain of events that's going to lead to an impaired ecosystem for VR. Even if it goes mainstream, we won't be able to get VR into the hands of every interested consumer, because not all of them have the space, and space is a premium good. Two addenda for the end of this video. First off, I am ignoring or excluding public spaces that contain consumer-grade VR arcades and the like, but that's because at the present moment, it's a gross idea. And it's just no doubt not as cost-effective as sticking a bunch of regular games in a space. Secondly, I just want to point out that the lead developer in Dumpy the Elephant is a guy named Brian Shrink. He's a cool guy, and I loved working with him in VR game dev. But if you want to know what his next project after Dumpy was, it was a game where you jousted with hammers to break coffee mugs in a Chicago alley. This won an award. Follow your dreams. That is the second point in this video. Follow your dreams. If this game about a coffee cup and smashing coffee cups with hammers and locks can win an award, anything's possible. Life doesn't exist. What day is it? I'm so tired. If you like this video and you'd like to see more, I'd recommend subscribing. Patreon and social media links are in the description.